przedstawię się pokrótce. Ja nazywam się Julia Blażewska, jestem psycholożką, seksuolożką, psychoterapeutką w trakcie kształcenia w szkole behawioralnie. I to, co chciałam jeszcze powiedzieć, to, że być może część z Was zna Rozkosz Festiwal, którego jestem współorganizatorką i chciałabym dać Wam znać, że kolejna edycja odbędzie się w Poznaniu we wrześniu przyszłego roku, więc już Was serdecznie zapraszam. Współorganizuję to wydarzenie razem z naszymi sponsorkami, dziewczynami z Lulaping oraz z Magdą Świderską, więc serdecznie Was zapraszam. I też na wstępie chciałabym jeszcze podziękować naszemu sponsorowi, portalowi Uczę się Akt, który był dla nas ogromnym wsparciem, jeśli chodzi o transmisję i w ogóle zorganizowanie tego tutaj w zoomowej przestrzeni. Jeśli korzystacie ze szkoleń Uczę się Akt, to być może znacie już głosy tłumaczek naszych, czyli Karoliny i Agnieszki, które regularnie też właśnie tłumaczą te szkolenia. I też oczywiście część z Was dostała maila, że macie kod zniżkowy na szkolenie z dr Lori Brotto oraz na moje szkolenie, które prowadzę właśnie z Bartkiem Kleszczem na temat aktu i seksualności. Więc zapraszam, zachęcam. Szczególnie to szkolenie dr Lori Brotto jest, myślę, bardzo interesujące i też uzupełnia się z naszą dzisiejszą konferencją. I to tyle na ten temat. Więc teraz chciałabym bardzo zaprosić na kolejny wykład dr Holly Richmond. Bardzo dziękuję, że przyjęłaś nasze zaproszenie. Jest dla nas naprawdę bardzo ważne i takie wartościowe, że możemy gościć Ciebie w naszej przestrzeni i jakoś uczyć.
Julio, mamy problem z tłumaczeniem. Właśnie dostałam prośbę od Holly, więc jakbyś mogła chwilkę poczekać. Po prostu nie słyszę tłumaczenia.
I think I just got it. We'll try again. I apologize.
Okej. Więc tak, na początku się przedstawiłam, tak dla streszczenia dla Ciebie, Holly. Na początku się przedstawiłam, ja nazywam się Julia Bilerzewska, jestem właśnie tutaj psycholożką i seksuolożką. I przedstawiłam naszego jednego ze sponsorów, który pomaga nam tutaj organizacyjnie na Zoomie i transmisji. I tak, chciałabym teraz bardzo Tobie podziękować. Naszą gościnią jest dr Holly Richmond. Bardzo podziękować za to, że zgodziłaś się poświęcić swój czas. Jest to dla nas bardzo takie ważne, że możemy uczyć się od Ciebie i jakoś pomiędzy tej różnicy kontynentów i czasów jakoś złapać się tutaj w tej przestrzeni internetowej. Myślę, że to jest naprawdę bardzo, bardzo cenne. Doktor Holly Richmond jest psychoterapeutką somatyczną, certyfikowaną terapeutką małżeństw i rodzin, a także terapeutką seksualną, więc to jest takie naprawdę wyjątkowe połączenie wiedzy, umiejętności. Oprócz tego jest zastępczynią dyrektora Modern Sex Therapy Institute i napisała książkę, która została wydana w Polsce w zeszłym roku. W Polsce jest to tytuł Odzyskać siebie. O, wspaniale. Właśnie tytuł jest troszeczkę inny. Po angielsku w oryginale jest to Reclaiming Pleasure, czyli odzyskać przyjemność. Po polsku jest to bardziej, myślę, ocenzurowana opcja. Ale myślę, że z treścią to się nie wyklucza, że to jest właśnie odzyskiwaniu siebie, swojego erosa, swojego własnego głosu, swojej witalności. Tak, książkę bardzo oczywiście polecam, jest naprawdę dawką bardzo ważnych rzeczy. Mam po prostu wszystkie strony pozaznaczane z ważnymi myślami. I tak, bardzo dziękuję jeszcze raz za przyjęcie zaproszenia i zapraszam do wysłuchania.
Oh, Julia, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And I'm happy to be here. And I still haven't quite figured out how this happened, but whoever in Poland helped this become this, I am just so grateful. And again, happy to be here with you all today. So we're going to cover a lot of territory. So we're going to cover sexual trauma, we're going to cover somatic psychology, and sex therapy. I'm just going to give you a little bit of background how these three areas came together for me, because I really think it will help to inform and integrate all the information that we're going to talk about. So I did most of my 3,000 hours at a rape crisis center in California. And I was taught very well how to treat sexual trauma, but I quickly noticed that there was a gap, and that gap helped me ask the question, what comes next? I knew I wanted my clients to be able to have healthy relationships, and I knew I wanted to help them have great sex. So in that, it's this concept of moving from surviving to thriving. And what we're talking about today is really this idea of thriving, to grow, flourish, prosper, and realize a goal despite and because of my circumstances. And because, of course, those circumstances are experiencing sexual trauma. So where we're going, right? Thriving and eroticism live together. This construct of eroticism, I absolutely want to give credit to my friend and colleague, Esther Perel, who has studied desire and eros. But when we think about eros, the root of eroticism, it can be sexual, but it doesn't have to be. And with so many of my clients, survivors of sexual trauma, they're not often ready to talk about the sex therapy piece. So we kind of move them into that territory a little bit more slowly by talking about eros, which translates to life force, vitality, vivacity, imagination, co-creation, and creativity. So when we look at eros and healing, it's really instead of waiting for our patients to discover it when they're better, we carefully and intentionally introduce avenues for imagination, creativity, and play. So how I work, especially when I'm treating couples or an individual, there's a parallel process in every therapy session of the communication, talk therapy, trauma therapy, but also that hands-on, not me doing the hands-on, but giving them that hands-on somatic sex therapy homework to do at home. So again, like the trauma therapy and the sex therapy are in parallel process. And when we bring the body into this equation, I just find that healing happens so much more quickly and it becomes integrated. So the mind and body are very much on the same page. We're not just up here. So each of these qualities, eroticism, demand a degree of control, openness, and desire. Eroticism is the essential bridge between feeling safe and feeling deserving. So I need to move this far out of the way. So prerequisites or foundation for eroticism. Safety is a prerequisite for pleasure, and risk is a prerequisite for eroticism. So when we get into the Reclaiming Pleasure protocol today, we're going to talk about the dialectic between safety and risk. And it's never risk in the way that we could be hurt. It's knowing we're safe, even though we're not in a rigid, super controlled container anymore. So some other foundations that I work with are this idea that anxiety overrides cognition. So that's important when we look at our 4 trauma responses: fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. And the next one is this idea that awareness precedes choice. So, too fast? Okay. Yeah, of course, sorry about that. And then the next concept is this idea that awareness precedes choice. So we have to have awareness before we can make a choice to change things. So the construct that I work through is awareness, understanding, and behavior change. And it really has to happen in that order. We can't change our behavior if we don't have an awareness that something is wrong. And we can't change our behavior unless we really understand what's happening for us. So of course, with sexual trauma, when we understand what happened to us, right? Which of those 4 trauma reactions did we utilize? Understand how that really saved us, that our body is on our team, on our side. It wasn't trying to betray us. From that position and from that position only can we make the behavior change. Another fundamental aspect of healing from sexual trauma is separating the past from the present. And I'm going to share one of my favorite mantras for that in a little bit. When we're talking about anxiety, the way I frame this is taking ourselves to the bad movies. So what that really is anticipatory anxiety projection. So how can we do our best to stay in the present? And then kind of the fun, explorative aspect of what we're going to be covering today is discovering your sexual template and looking at the foundations of sexuality, really settling into the fact that sex and self are not dualistic. I am my sexuality is me. There's not my sexual health over here and me over here, but these are really one and the same. So we're not doing sex, but we're being sex. So what is trauma? So there's some beautiful definitions, explanations of trauma that I love. One of the ones that I refer to most often that is simplest is trauma is too much too soon. And that can apply to any kind of trauma, but I think it's very appropriate for sexual trauma. So here's just a few quotes from my favorite quotes. The top one from Dr. Peter Levine. The second is from my book. So trauma is an experience that dramatically reduces our range of expression, leaving us with fewer words, less tolerable access to touch, and more tenuous relational bonds. Trauma is a state of disconnection. The cure is intimacy and authentic connection to self and others. I'm not going to read all of this, but you can see it here. So sexual trauma is really a broad term. I am a stickler for calling sexual trauma what it is. So the first part of this book is really defining sexual trauma. Was it sexual abuse? Was it intimate partner sexual violence, spousal rape? Was it date rape? Was it gender violence? Was it sexual assault? So really helping people to understand what happened to them. Again, that understanding part of the construct that I just took you through, that's essential. So we want to call it what it is because words inform our experience. And in my experience, it's really hard to heal from something that we don't understand. So naming what our sexual trauma is critical to this process. So the broad effects of sexual trauma, I know so many of us are experienced with these, but increased sexual trauma increases the prevalence of psychological and physiological symptoms, including depression, anxiety, chronic pain, chronic illness, autoimmune disorders, lack of boundaries, dissociation, and OCD. I just wanted to give a little bit of airtime here to our non-binary identified survivors. So a 2012 report from the Office of Victims of Crime reported that transgender people experience sexual assault and sexual abuse at shockingly higher levels, up to 66% higher than people outside of the transgender or transsexual community. My book is written for all survivors, but does not do a deep dive into non-binary trans-identified survivors. And there's two resources here if those feel appropriate for you or appropriate for the people that you work with. So this is me being a little bit provocative here, but there's really no such thing as non-consensual sex. And this goes with what I was saying a little bit ago, that words inform our experience. So we need to call it what it is. For some people, using the term sexual trauma is going to be as much as they can handle. For some people, naming it what it is incredibly important. So if they were sexually abused, they want to say I was sexually abused. If they are raped, they want to say I was raped, just to help that process integrate in them so they can reclaim that understanding and really taking their life to that place of thriving. So we don't say non-consensually taking someone's stuff, we say stealing. We don't say non-consensually hitting someone, we say assault and battery. We don't say non-consensually killing someone, we say homicide. When we say non-consensual sex, that to me is a way that the media and most often the patriarchy can kind of dampen things because non-consensual sex sounds much nicer than raping someone. So a little bit of what we're going to be talking about today, and we don't have a ton of time here, but is social justice and really affecting change on a larger level. And to me, calling it what it is a part of that. Misconceptions and head trips about sexual trauma. So when I was working at the Rape Crisis Center, and I would say still even in my practice, it takes 10 years on average for a survivor of sexual trauma to seek treatment. And a lot of people have a hard time understanding that. We're going to talk about why that is. In general, I would say, of course, most survivors of sexual trauma are trying to minimize their trauma. So they don't want it to mean anything. So they do everything they can to deal with it on their own. So that might be alcohol, that might be drugs, that could lead to an inability to maintain healthy relationships. But they really try everything they can on their own before internalizing how much of an impact their sexual trauma had. Sexual trauma, of course, can happen more than once, and it almost always does. So this idea that someone would have to be profoundly unlucky to experience 2 instances of sexual trauma is completely erroneous. So let's take someone who was sexually abused at the age of 11. She has a very good chance of experiencing some kind of sexual trauma in adulthood because of shame, because of low self-worth, and because of her inability to hold appropriate boundaries. It's nothing to do with luck. The reason why someone is raped or sexually abused are entirely unfounded. And I'm sure I'm speaking to the choir here, what you all know. So because someone drank too much, because someone was using drugs, because someone was in the wrong neighborhood, because someone was wearing the wrong clothes or clothes that revealed a lot, those are all completely unfounded reasons. One of the provocative statements that I like to say is, I don't care if you were sitting on a street corner naked. The only reason you were raped is because a rapist walked by. Most people would have brought you a coat. And that is 100% the truth. I know for all of us sitting here, if we saw someone in need, someone who was suffering, someone who couldn't stand up for themselves in any moment, we would protect them. People are raped because there's a perpetrator nearby, because those perpetrators are opportunistic. Another thing I want to challenge, especially in the media over the last 2 or 3 years, is this idea that survivors frequently false report. That is categorically untrue. Survivors false report at the exact same rate as other felonies, which is only 2 to 8%. And again, as I'm sure you guys know, the reporting process is traumatic in and of itself. No one steps easily or readily into that. It's a very long, drawn-out process that can be re-traumatizing for survivors. This is a huge one and really the foundation of sexual trauma. Sexual trauma is not necessarily violent, but is always violating. What the media likes to tell us is that for sexual trauma to be real, someone has to jump out of the bushes or be hiding in the backseat of our car to make it count. Most often, over 85% of the time, the perpetrator is known to the survivor, and there are never any bruises or cuts or visible impacts of the sexual trauma, just this idea that it's violating. And then the treatment of stranger rape, which is that construct that I just talked about, a perpetrator unknown that jumps out, is hiding somewhere, versus most sexual trauma. So people who experience stranger rape, they are almost always going to report right away. They are not the client that I see most often, and it's not most sexual trauma. They are going to report because they know that that happened to them. They had nothing to do with it. That's external, and they weren't complicit in that situation. Whereas most sexual trauma, that shame is internalized because I knew the perpetrator, I tell myself I should have said no sooner. I shouldn't have been in that neighborhood, whatever it is, but there's some way that I feel complicit and shame is keeping me on the hook. So much of my work too, again, with the sex therapy aspects, blends in the idea of sexual health and that sexuality and self are not dualistic, nor sexual health and overall health. If you're disconnected from your sexuality, you disconnect from yourself. And it was not too long ago that who finally added pleasure into the definition of sexual health. The more simplistic definition that I like to use is the Foundation 6 Principles of Sexual Health from Doug Braun-Harvey. You can see them here: mutual pleasure, shared values, honesty, non-exploitation, consent, and of course, protection from HIV, sexually transmitted infections, and unintended pregnancies. For most people, they've never really thought about sexual health, and they've certainly never prioritized it, particularly survivors of sexual trauma. So as we get into the sex therapy territory, I approach everything from a sex positive perspective, and my definition of sex positivity is this: all sex is good sex as long as it's consensual or pleasurable. So we literally have 2 boxes that we need to check. Consent first and foremost. Nothing can happen without consent. And that second box is pleasure. And again, it still amazes me 17 years into doing this work that so many people, particularly survivors, have never considered that sex is supposed to be pleasurable, especially if they had an instance of sexual abuse in their childhood. Everything becomes about their partner or partners, and it's not about themselves. So 2 boxes to check: consent and pleasure. I mentioned earlier that we're going to be looking at this through a somatic psychology lens as well. So somatic meaning the body. So safety nor pleasure can be reclaimed only through the mind. These are sensational experiences which are physically sensed and emotionally felt. In the moment the body feels unpredictable and unruly, it is not trying to betray us, but rather to save us. And what I'm really talking about here is those 4 trauma responses that we're all quite familiar with: fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. And we're going to talk more specifically about freeze and fawn in just a few minutes, because those are the 2 that most often happen in sexual trauma. So our bodies can become stuck in survival mode because of these responses, even when a trauma occurred so long ago that the brain has long since buried its memory. The body remembers. And that's from Susan Babel. So the somatic sex therapy construct that I work with is really simple. It's a scale of 1 to 10. On one side, we have full collapse, laxity, chaos. This is going to feel like depression, complete immobility. The center, that 4 to 6 range, is going to be fluidity, flexibility. So a healed nervous system is a flexible nervous system. And on the other end of that scale, up towards 10, is going to be complete constriction, rigidity, full-on panic attack. So if we're in collapse, deep depression over here, panic attack is here. So when I'm sitting with any client, I'm always assessing every session, where is their nervous system today? And how do I feel when I sit with this person? Because my nervous system is going to pick that up as well. And what I'm really trying to figure out in that moment, am I upregulating that person to that center of flexibility, or am I downregulating them? And to heal from sexual trauma, we really need to have that flexible nervous system, because if we're always up here around a 9, it's really hard to heal from there. And if we're always down around a 2 or 3 in that shame state, that victimhood, it's hard to heal from there as well. So this pro-symptom approach that I use and was taught in my somatic psychology PhD is really the second question of, what is my body saying that I cannot? So what's wrong with me? Why am I broken? Those are all the wrong question. What is my body saying that I cannot? So within this framework, so we're really listening to the pain to give it meaning. We're looking at the symptom and know that that is a clue to healing. And from that place, we're doing bottom-up processing. So most psychotherapy and psychology is top-down. We start from the brain, and then if we're lucky, our psychologist will include the body. Oftentimes they don't. From my perspective, when we're working somatically and in the world of sex therapy, we're working from the bottom up. So we're going to look at the body either before we're talking really to the ego or in parallel process with working with the ego, the psyche. So the somatic approach, this is from Dr. Gabor Mate, who I so appreciate his work. And I just want to note, he had a video come out this week with Mel Robbins, that they really looked about somatic symptoms in women in particular, and why women have more autoimmune disease and disorder than men do, and what are the somatic qualities that affect that. And some of that is what we're talking about today. The spoiler alert there is nervous system based, right? So when we're not in a regulated nervous system, when we're constantly anxious or we have suppressed anger, we get sick. And we know that that is so true for survivors of sexual trauma. Working with qualities of embodiment, again, is key to helping survivors get to that thriving space, not just to surviving. So embodiment bridges the disconnection between emotional pain experienced in the psyche and physical pain felt in the body. So we're not ignoring one in service to the other. We're not prioritizing one over the other. Survivors of sexual trauma have extraordinarily sensitive nervous systems, wired particularly to the nuances of relationships and the inherent expectations that live within them. When you heal your trauma, you heal your nervous system. When you heal your nervous system, you heal your body. And when you heal your body, you heal your mind. So hopefully you can really feel that bottoms up approach there, that we're working with the body in order for the healing, that integrated healing, to be successful. Separating the past from the present, which I spoke to just a little bit ago, but this is a beautiful way to say it, and I want to give you probably my favorite mantra of all times. So ultimately, the main goal of trauma therapy is to relegate the trauma to its rightful place in the client's past. For that, explicit memory processes must be engaged to secure the context of the event in time and space. And that's from Babette Rothschild. One of my mentors gave me this beautiful mantra that I employ so often in my practice, which is this: that was then, this is now. That was then, this is now. So for most survivors, they know I'm here now, but they feel like they're living in the then. Their nervous system is still trapped then when their sexual trauma happened. So again, what we're trying to do is get them to this moment of presence, awareness, understanding, and then out here to behavior change. So rethinking blame and shame. This is a huge part of my job as a trauma therapist. My clients can't feel empowered if they feel responsible, right? So that word responsible, complicit, what we talked about a few slides ago. And I talk about keeping themselves on the hook. So that hook of shame, of feeling complicit, of feeling like I didn't scream no enough, I didn't fight back enough, that disconnects them from pleasure and passion. I'm constantly asking, not quite this directly, but roundabout, every session, where does the blame lie? I ask it time and time again, and the answer always has to be with the perpetrator. When I can get a survivor to really sink in that they had nothing to do with being sexually abused, sexually assaulted, raped, and it was their perpetrator's fault, and that their body took care of them, that's like such a golden place for the integration process and healing to grow from. So when we get that hook out, the healing can come in. The depth and weight of the hook, the painful attachment to self-blame, is determined by how a survivor judges their reaction during their sexual trauma, not typically to the trauma itself. The hook is wedged in feeling complicit and responsible, even to the slightest degree. It finds its grip in part due to the erroneous belief that if you didn't say no, you must have meant yes. So the part of this I want to highlight, most of my clients are feeling shame for how they reacted to the trauma, not to the trauma itself. And again, this is where the media gets it wrong. The media thinks healing from sexual trauma means that you're getting over PTSD or the cuts or the bruises or that crisis situation. That's not most sexual trauma. Sexual trauma is getting over and getting rid of the shame and that self-blame that has been so erroneously placed. So we talked about our 4 reactions: fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. How we can get from react to respond is this. A response requires awareness and presence, and it requires you to breathe. Holding our breath leads to fear or anger, constriction, and rigidity. Those are properties that are not conducive to great sex. We need openness and fluidity. So when my clients ask me, what does it take for me to respond and not react? I say a breath. So I'm not going to go over all of these, but this PowerPoint is yours. You can refer to it at any time, but these are the common symptoms of freeze and fawn, which again, most survivors of sexual trauma, that's how they would have reacted. Right? So freeze is kind of dissociating, leaving your body. Fawn is being nice, being compliant, going along to get along. Both of those are in service to not getting hurt any worse. End of the story. They are our nervous systems and our subconscious ways of protecting us, right? They knew fighting was not going to work. Our perpetrator's almost always bigger or more powerful. Running away is very rarely an option. So we've got 2 left, freeze and fawn. And the problem that why those are so connected to shame is because they seem inactive, but I promise you they are very active and very protective. So the wheel of effects that I look at are emotional, sexual, relational, and psychological. So these are just some of the effects that survivors of sexual trauma will experience that most people don't know about. This is chapter 6 of the book, and it is absolutely everyone's favorite chapter. It's that eye-opener. If I write another book on this, it's going to be exploring chapter 6. Here are some of the physical consequences or the somatic. Of course, eating disorders and sexual trauma, unfortunately, go like this. Sexual repercussions, avoiding sex, being compulsive around sex. Anorgasmia means inability to orgasm. Tocophobia, fear of childbirth. Pain, vaginismus, dysphonia. And relational. So it just becomes very hard to be in relationship with people, confusing sex for love, having a lot of triggers around deep connection or vulnerability. So the Reclaiming Pleasure Protocol, we're just going to move through this in the next 15 minutes. So we have plenty of time for questions and answers. So I mentioned that I did most of my 3,000 hours for my internship to get my license at a rape crisis center, and that I learned there how to treat sexual trauma, but I very much felt like something is missing. I don't know how to talk about sex with people because that was not part of my master's program. So that's when I started the sex therapy program and decided to write my dissertation on the recovery of sexual health after sexual assault. That dissertation became the book Reclaiming Pleasure. So I did a grounded theory qualitative dissertation looking at what constructs does it take to help people recover from sexual assault, sexual trauma. The first construct that I discovered is control. And within the construct of control, there's maintaining control and there's relinquishing control. And of course, maintaining control seems self-evident. For anyone who has experienced sexual trauma, they are going to want to be in control of where they are, in control of who they're with, and very much in control of their body. So that makes sense. The flip side of this, and perhaps the more important as far as healing and thriving are concerned, are the ability to relinquish control. So most survivors that come into my office look like they have it all together, right? Their life is pretty in control, but it might be too rigid. So they might have issues around food. They might have issues around exercise. They might have issues around where they can go and feel safe and where they can't. So they're really locked down, rigid, and in control. So my job with them, to help get them to a place where they can experience pleasure and connection, is to help them loosen those reins, right? So when we looked at that nervous system before, they're up at that 8, 9, 10. They are just on lockdown. I've got to get them to that 4, 5, 6 range so that love and connection and pleasure, all of those qualities of eroticism that we began this presentation with, can find their way in. So when we're talking about control, this quote from Elizabeth Gilbert is just one of my favorite. You are afraid of surrender because you don't want to lose control, but you never had control. All you had was anxiety. And again, that just points to our nervous system scale. We're always running at an 8, 9, 10. Getting us back to that fluidity, flexibility zone is where life and eroticism can really take hold. The next construct that I discovered, so the second of the 3, so the first one we've got control, the second is pleasure. To reclaim the essential facets of your sexual health, it's time to affirm your pleasure as your birthright, not an afterthought. As you learn to prioritize pleasure, sex will transcend an act of physicality and become an undertaking of self-forgiveness, self-acceptance, and self-empowerment. Pleasure is your outstretched hand in search of eros, your vital life force that extends far beyond the bedroom. So the control portion of the protocol makes sense, right? We keep control, we relinquish control. The pleasure part of the protocol can often be really exciting for my clients. For some, like going straight to sex is too much, but we can do pleasure in a way that's non-sexual. So what I love helping people with is discovering their sexual template and really figuring out how they desire. So this idea that sexual pleasure is a privilege, you have erroneously accepted that sex will be bad because it has been bad. That's not acceptance, it's forfeit. So again, when we talk about pleasure, we're really looking at how we want. How do we discover sexual template? So we look at 2 constructs. The first is desire, and the second is arousal. Desire is a psychological process of wanting from a place of vitality. So it's happening more in our head. It's a longing for pleasure inspired by truth. And that's from sex educator Laura Zam. Desire is generated by your mind as you think about or notice what's sexy, which is almost always erotic, charged with vitality, but not necessarily sexual. Arousal, on the other hand, is a physiological process. It includes responding to a sexual or erotic cue. Arousal is literally what turns you on. You'll notice that you're feeling about it, not thinking about it, most notably in your body. It can be subtle like butterflies or your heart beating faster, or more overt like noticing yourself get genitally aroused through lubrication or an erection. For survivors, arousal may be particularly confusing. It is possible to be aroused solely through touch or a sexual cue, exclusive of feeling desire. It is critical to re-examine arousal from a space of control, including safety and freedom of choice, in order to embrace a full range of pleasure. So what I'm talking about here when arousal is coming just through one channel is this idea of arousal non-concordance. And I heard Dr. Lori Brado's name mentioned before. She talks about this beautifully Emily Nagoski talks about this beautifully. Dr. Lori Mintz, all of them, Dr. Lori Mintz's book, Getting Cliterate, really great books out there on arousal non-concordance, meaning our mind and body are not on the same page of what turns us on, right? So for someone who is sexually abused, they know that they don't want to be touched, but their body is responding, right? So my head says no, my body says yes. And there's certainly other instances where my body is saying no and my head is saying yes. So that would be a survivor who is in a completely safe relationship with a long-term partner. She wants to be able to have sex with him. So her head is saying yes, and her body is saying no by not getting lubricated or having pain during intercourse. So vulvodynia, dyspnea, vaginismus, something like that. The third component of the protocol, so we've got control, pleasure, and the third is connection. So while control is fundamental, we can't go anywhere without control. Control is our consent. Pleasure, absolutely necessary to live a life of thriving. That can be the exciting part. Connection, when we get to the connection piece, my clients are often like, oh my gosh, this is the scary piece. This is where I have to go out into the world and actually do it, right? Connect, be vulnerable, be authentic. So these are just a few of my favorite quotes on connection. Healthy relationships can only take shape when reciprocity exists, and what we need and ask for is offered, and when the qualities that are finally shining through us are reflected back. Connection at its core takes risk. To be connected, you must be vulnerable. Vulnerability is the high art of connection. So with my survivors, with couples, I'm walking them through different exercises, including sensate focus, including tantric exercises. So every session they're getting homework that is written plus homework that they take into the privacy of their own home. So the principles of connection show us that most people are only as needy as their unmet needs. And connection plays a central role in breaking patterns around vulnerability and stress, and that physical and psychological stress will diminish through the development of coping mechanisms that involve others. That is so true. And for so many of their survivors, we're autonomous, we're independent. I can do it myself, but that quality of thriving really demands connection. So connection's primacy in the ability to heal and thrive is absolute. There's no way around this one. I'm not saying a survivor has to be in a romantic or an intimate relationship, but there's got to be somebody, some organization that they can feel like themselves with, when they can completely let their nervous system rest, they can be vulnerable and authentic. So I just mentioned before, so I'll take my clients through mindful sex protocol, about accessing self-state awareness. Where are they on that nervous system scale? Engaging self-state regulation. Can they learn to move themselves up and down that nervous system scale? Can they hyper-regulate or hypo? And then offering self-state compassion. That's that idea that we talked about of letting ourselves off the hook. How can I get myself to a place where I know I was not complicit in anything, that was really me taking care of myself? Daily connection practices. So model to others how you want to be treated, respect your own boundaries, cultivate self-awareness. That is therapy. That's the whole goal of therapy, is to cultivate self-awareness, know what I'm doing in the moment. How is this serving me? How is this not serving me? Practice behaving non-defensively, so learning how to respond rather than react. That would change the world if more of us could learn how to do this. And increasing eye contact, which again is that piece of connection. There's some tantric threads there, vulnerability and authenticity. The fourth phase that I do talk about in reclaiming pleasure that I didn't discover in my dissertation, but is so much of the work I do now, is this idea of fantasy and this erotic lens. So our erotic knowledge empowers us becomes a lens through which we scrutinize all aspects of our existence, forcing us to evaluate those aspects honestly in terms of their relative meaning within our lives. And this is a grave responsibility projected from within each of us, not to settle for the convenient, the shoddy, the conventionally expected, nor the merely safe. That's from Audre Lorde. And of course, her writing is just out of this world. The part that's really important to me here with the reclaiming pleasure model is we're not settling for what's merely safe. Thriving goes a step beyond that. Thriving is that piece that brings in pleasure and connection. So self-awareness and sexual self-efficacy, so often survivors of sexual trauma think it's like a vampire bite, and once they're bitten, they're going to go out, and if they don't do it to others, they feel like they can't get healed enough to be a good parent, to be a good friend, to be a good partner. But the least likely people to pass down generational trauma or sexual trauma are the ones self-aware enough to be afraid they will. That's from Nate Postlewith. So often, again, my clients are coming in afraid that they're broken, they're stuck with this forever, and that is categorically untrue. And I've seen thousands and thousands of people heal over the years that really are fabulous parents, they're fabulous partners, and most importantly, they're having really good sex lives. So sexual conversations, I won't read all of these, but again, this PowerPoint is yours, and I encourage you to come back to it. One of my favorite questions here is the aspect of my sexual story I would like to leave behind. What are the things we want to leave behind? What are those aspects of sexual health, those 6 principles of sexual health that we talked about at the beginning that I really want to reclaim, that I've never even considered for myself before? Trauma is one of the greatest threats to imagination. Imagination allows us to access healing from the present, where we have more resources than we did during the time of our trauma. And that's from Dr. Stephen Porges. Imagination helps us to step into the construct of that was then, this is now. Eroticism is intimate, and it's an antidote to deadness. And again, this is from Esther Perel's work. But really this idea of connection, imagination, and reclaiming pleasure, they all have to go together. That's a little bit of that risk tolerance, right? What can I dare to dream from my life? When I decide and I can move through this idea of like, I'm not broken. I'm not stuck with feeling like a victim of sexual trauma. I'm not even sitting in the place of survivorship anymore. I'm really in this place of thriving and reclamation. Lastly, I'm just going to leave you with a little bit of the social justice piece around reclaiming pleasure. And the first of that is to retell your story. There is such power in our words. And again, words inform our experience, from this idea of calling our sexual trauma what it is, to telling our story to a trusted friend, a trusted partner, or even a therapist. Saying those words, letting that shame move through us, get out into the world, and being validated for all the ways we took care of ourselves is really essential. The other piece is daring to empathize. So this idea of empathy, stepping into someone's shoes, or really even stepping into our own shoes and understanding deeply how our trauma responses, that freeze or fawn, again, was there to take care of us, that our body and all the somatic reactions that it may have had over the years has really been just an alarm bell saying, pay attention here. Back to this idea that we're not broken, but there are things that we need to pay attention to. So we can empathize with ourselves, we can empathize with others, and then that has the potential to change so much. And then lastly, the biggest FU to our perpetrators and to the systems of patriarchy, where survivors are diminished and not believed, is to really have great sex. So there's nothing better that we can do to reclaim our sex lives, which again is reclaiming an integral part of ourselves and stepping into these constructs of eroticism, of vitality, vivacity, independence, imagination, and creativity. So again, I just want to say thank you. This is the book in English. And this is the book in Polish. And again, I'm just so grateful to be here with you all today. So I'd be happy to take any questions. And then please, I want you to connect with me. Here's all the ways. Instagram is a great way. You can send me a message. I will absolutely get back to you, or you can message me through my website. Whoops, I'm just trying to get back a slide. So if there are any questions, I am happy to take them.
Tak, mamy kilka pytań od uczestniczek. Pierwsze z nich to, jakie są teorie tłumaczące wyższy wskaźnik nadużyć seksualnych wobec osób niebinarnych?
Because they're already a marginalized population without much social support. So they've already been isolated in some way because they feel different. The systems, certainly in the US, I'm not sure about in Poland, do not support our non-binary identified survivors. A lot of times, if we look at the data, non-binary people who have experienced some kind of trauma, whether it's capital T trauma or little t trauma in their early childhood. So again, boundaries might not be so great, and they just don't have the connection and the support that they deserve to because of society, because of their family of origin.
Kolejne pytanie. To, że nie mieliśmy winy, ma też taki przerażający kawałek, to znaczy, że nie mieliśmy na coś wpływu. To może być trudne, bo odbiera sprawczość, kontrolę. Jak zaopiekować tę część, czyli odbudować zaufanie pomimo braku kontroli?
Yeah, we did not have control in the moment of our sexual trauma. That is absolutely true. So again, when someone comes into me, I'm trying to figure out where they are in their life. Nothing to do with sex yet, but how controlled are they in their life? Are they in that state of collapse, or are they in the state of rigidity? And this is a great question and so foundational to what I do. So again, do they need more control in their lives, or do they need to relinquish control so that they can step into pleasure and connection? How I do that is verbally and therapy. I've got these great yes-no exercises. I do it somatically with this. So I'm using hand gestures they will tell me to go back. They will tell me to come close. They will protect their personal space and know that their no means something. We will work with, let's say they've got issues with food. So we would work on either having more control with their food if they are binge eaters, less control with their food if they tend to restrict intake. We would do the same thing with exercise. We would do the same thing with things around the home, that playing with control with who they feel like they can go and see or be with, and even around sex if they are there yet. So I'm just like looking at all areas of their life and trying to figure out, are they like grasping for control, or are they lax with their control?
Kolejne pytanie to, jak podjąć ambiwalencję klienta, który może czuć wstyd i winę za doświadczoną traumę seksualną, i my możemy mieć jakąś opinię na ten temat, jednoznaczne podejście, ale u klientów to czasami może wywoływać opór i jeszcze więcej ambiwalencji. Więc tutaj pytanie, jak można pracować z takim, z próbą przyjęcia przez klienta tego odmiennego punktu widzenia.
Okay, I think what you're saying is the client comes in, maybe do you mean the ambiguity is that they're like, no, I certainly had something to do with this. I feel guilty, and they're not willing to put that down. So really they're in that kind of, I don't know if they're in the victim mindset or the survivor mindset, but it's hard to pull them out of that place. So I think you're telling me they just do not want to see that their nervous system took care of them, that their body, that freeze or fawn response was really the most adaptive thing they possibly could have done in the moment. They want to hold on to the shame and blame. There's a lot of ways to work with that therapeutically. I would say one of my favorite is to make it third person. So speak to them as if it was happening to their daughter, their sister, their mother. How would they empathize with that person? That can be a strategy that I use. And people like this, this takes years. Like this is years of therapy, years of patience, years of like chipping away at that shame and blame. While kind of helping them build up other areas of their lives so they can learn to trust themselves, stepping into connection and vulnerability with other people. That feels really important in this process as well.
Jest jeszcze kilka pytań. Niestety mamy już końcówkę czasu, ale może jeszcze takie bardzo króciutkie na temat wskazówek dla osób, które są w związku romantycznym lub relacji seksualnej z osobą, która doświadczyła traumy seksualnej. Czy masz jakieś wskazówki?
Oh my gosh, I do. I literally have 2 sheets of do's and don'ts of talking to a sexual, to your romantic partner about your sexual trauma. Julia, I can email those to you. Maybe there's going to be like a resource site with this conference where people can go to. I'm going to email those to you right now. But in short, we're not asking, why did this happen? Why didn't you tell me? Why did you stay in a relationship with your perpetrator? We're absolutely going to let the survivor take control for several weeks, if not several months, of how sex happens, how intimacy happens, so that they have control over their saying no and saying yes. We're going to give resources, international and national resources for how to do that. But essentially it comes down to the partner not asking questions, but just really being supportive and empathetic and knowing that this idea of reclaiming pleasure in our sexual lives takes so many months, so many years. But I'm going to email that to Julia right now, and you will have that in your resources page. It's I think it's about 20 points long of the do's and don'ts of, again, sharing with a romantic partner. It's a great question, by the way. Thank you.
Dziękuję. Czy zostały jeszcze 3 pytania? Czy w razie czego mogłabym wysłać je do Ciebie mailem i odpowiedziałabyś, ja wtedy wrzuciłabym to na Instagram, żeby osoby mogły dostać odpowiedź?
Of course.
Bardzo dziękuję w imieniu naszej społeczności za to, że zgodziłaś się i za ten wspaniały wykład. Był naprawdę pełen wiadomości i tak naprawdę godzina to za mało, żeby się tego wszystkiego dowiedzieć, ale to i tak naprawdę bardzo duże taka dawka wiedzy, jakieś perspektywy na ten temat. Bardzo dziękuję. I cóż, zostały nam 2 minutki dosłownie do naszego ostatniego wykładu. Także jeszcze raz bardzo